Good evening, everyone. My name is Purvaja Modak, and I'm a research fellow for International Relations Geoeconomics at CPPR, the Center for Public Policy Research. I welcome you all to CPPR's webinar on the Indo-Pacific Strategy, Reimagining the Maritime Outlook, the United States and India as partners in the Indo-Pacific region. CPPR is an independent think tank, a public policy organization dedicated to in-depth research and scientific analysis with the objective of delivering actionable ideas that could transform society. We are based out of Kochi in the Indian state of Kerala. Our engagement in public policy that began in 2004 has initiated open dialogue, policy changes, and institutional transformation in the areas of urban reform, livelihood, education, health, governance, law, international relations, and security. We also have a training and development arm called CPPR Academy. This is the second of 4 webinars that CPPR is hosting as part of a project on US-India relations, change, continuity, and transformation. These are co-hosted with and are possible due to a grant from the United States Consulate General of Chennai, the Public Affairs section. The first one on the US-India Partnership on Climate Change was held on June 17th, 2021, and was a great success. The remaining 2 webinars will be held in October and December of this year. The topics are as follows: trade relations between the United States and India, and science and technology cooperation, respectively. These topics are the 4 pillars on which the US-India relationship rests, and this is an opportune time for us to discuss these and put forth a concrete and action-oriented agenda for the Biden administration. We are live streaming on Facebook. You can find all the content related to this webinar series on our website, www.cppr.in, and on our social media accounts. If you would like to tweet about our webinar, please use hashtag US-India Partners for Change and tag the Twitter handles @CPPRIndia and @US and Chennai on it. You can also tag our speakers for the day. The Indo-Pacific region has assumed a great strategic and economic significance in the last decade. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe referred to the confluence of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans in his speech in the Indian Parliament in 2007 as the dynamic coupling as the seas of freedom and of prosperity in the broader Asia. Since then, this term has acquired salience within the Indian government and has been used often by India's apex political leadership. However, an official documented articulation of this term was first put out in Australia's Defence White Paper in 2013. In 2019, the US State Department published a document formalizing the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific to be sustained among members of the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a partnership of 4 countries in the Indo-Pacific region, led by the United States and including Australia, India, and Japan, that are touted to take on a leadership role in the region. Prior to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's visit to New Delhi in July 2021, the United States reiterated its support for India's emergence as a leading global power and a vital partner in the efforts to ensure that the Indo-Pacific region is a region of peace, stability, and growing prosperity and economic inclusion. So before we begin our discussion on this fascinating topic, a warm welcome to all the participants who have logged in today from across the world. We look forward to engaging with you to enrich today's discussion. To put in your questions to our speakers, you can add them in the chat box below, and we will pose your questions to the speakers. With this, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Ms. Anne Lee Sheshadri. Anne is the Public Affairs Officer at the US Consulate General in Chennai. She has previously held diplomatic assignments in Bangkok, Thailand, Toronto, Canada, and New Delhi, India, as well as in Washington, DC. She has lived and worked across Southeast Asia and was a Boran Scholar in Hanoi, Vietnam. She holds a master's in development communications and a bachelor's in political science and has recently completed coursework at the Daniel Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii. I hand over the floor to you, Anne, for your remarks.
Thank you, Purvaja. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you so much for joining for this important discussion today. On behalf of the U.S. Consulate General in Chennai, I'd like to thank Ms. Dr. Dhanuraj, Ms. Angela, and the team at the Center for Public Policy Research for organizing this event, one in a series of panel discussions the consulate has funded to sharpen our focus on some of the key areas defining the U.S.-India relationship. There are few relationships in the world more vital than the one between the United States and India. As Purvaja just said, we kicked off the series in June, focused on US-India climate change and clean energy partnerships. And moving ahead in October and December, we look forward to sessions focused on US-India trade relations, as well as US-India partnerships in the field of critical and transformational technologies. These discussions have been designed to highlight prominent voices in foreign policy from South India, so I appreciate the inclusion of our friend Dr. Prabhakar today, alongside American expert voices. And so I thank Greg Pollak from CSIS for being with us. And we're very lucky to have Dr. Rajagopalan from ORF, and I believe she just moderated a panel with Admiral John C. Aquilino, our commander for US Indo-Pacific Command, so the timing could not be better. On Tuesday, speaking from Singapore, Vice President Harris emphasized the partnerships throughout the Indo-Pacific and said that they are a top priority for the United States and that the region holds critical importance to our nation's security and prosperity. Our intention is to strengthen our partnerships and reinforce our shared vision. What is this shared vision? Peace and stability, freedom on the seas, unimpeded commerce, advancing human rights, commitment to the international rules-based order, and the recognition that our common interests are not zero-sum. As mentioned, Admiral Aquilino only today completed a visit to India. He met with senior government and defense officials to further strengthen our major defense partnership with India. What a wonderful stage to set for our discussion today. I'll quote from him: "Our network of allies and partners are our greatest strength and a center of gravity in the Indo-Pacific. Our relationship with India is based on aligned values and presents an important model for building enduring partnerships. As we increase interoperability, information sharing, and access with allies and partners across the globe, this partnership enhances our capabilities, improves our coordination, and shows that we are stronger when we stand together." Before we move on in the program, I wanted to highlight a few initiatives that we have going on at the consulate to further build out our Indo-Pacific priorities. Our American Center in Chennai is building out an Indo-Pacific collection with books and resources on the region, and we'll be making book donations with leading universities in South India. We also have an Indo-Pacific toolkit put together by the East-West Center in Hawaii for select university partners. We hope to soon announce a major initiative to bring together scholars from the Indo-Pacific region, including for a conclave here in Chennai in 2022. We are also hoping to launch an academic competition for university students to test their knowledge of this vast and diverse region. And noting the longstanding cultural ties India has in the Indo-Pacific region, we'll be working with our colleagues at the US Consulate in Kolkata on performing arts exchanges. Finally, I wanted to flag that the 4th annual Indo-Pacific Business Forum will take place this year as a fully online event on October 28th and 29th. This project is in partnership with the Government of India, the US Chamber of Commerce, CII, FICCI, and the US ASEAN Business Council. So there's a lot going on. It's an exciting time, and I look forward to the discussion today. Without further ado, let me hand over the proceedings back to Purvaja Modak. I wish you all a great evening. Over to you.
Thank you, Anne, for your remarks. It is my distinct pleasure now to introduce our speakers. We have two of the best minds in the field with us today to discuss the US-India Indo-Pacific Partnership, Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai Rajgopalan and Mr. Gregory Pollak. Dr. Rajeshwari is the director for the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology, CSST, at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. She was a technical advisor to the United Nations group of governmental experts on the preventions of arms race in outer space. And she was also a non-resident Indo-Pacific Fellow at the Perth US Asia Center in 2020. As a senior Asia defense writer for The Diplomat, she writes a weekly column on Asian strategic issues. She joined ORF after a 5-year stint at the National Security Council Secretariat, the NSCS, of the Government of India, where she was an assistant director. I welcome you, ma'am. Gregory Pollak is a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and a director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS. He oversees research on US foreign policy in the Asia Pacific with a particular focus on the maritime domain and the countries of Southeast Asia. His research interests include the South China Sea disputes, democratization in Southeast Asia, and Asian multilateralism. Mr. Pollak's writings have been featured in Foreign Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, Nikkei Asian Review, and Foreign Policy, among others. A warm welcome to you both. This discussion will be moderated by Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar Williams. Lawrence, sir, as we call him, is an author, researcher, and professor for international relations and strategic studies, formerly working in the Department of Political Science of Madras Christian College. His research fellowships have been at IDSS and RSIS Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, the Fulbright Fellowship at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, political research fellowships at the Henry Stimson Center and the Center for Naval Analysis, USA. Among that, there are various other positions that he has held of importance. He is also a senior advisor with CPPR. I welcome you, sir, and I hand over the proceedings to you.
Thank you, Purvaja, for this warm words of welcome. I thank the Lord God for this opportunity to moderate this session. And this is an important topic which CPPR and the US Consulate have taken for today's evening discussion there. As well elucidated by Ms. Anne-Lee Sheshadri of the Stallions of the Indo-Pacific, let me just add a few points, which I will set the tone for the two panelists who will both speak for 10 minutes each. And then we will come with the subsequent interventions and then followed by the question and answer session there. The Indo-US relations basically has a very strong strategic security convergence ever since 1992. We like the proposals which accentuated the Indo-US partnership very much in the maritime domain there. And this has been based on what we could call the Malabar series of exercises that has come a very long way. And today we find that the bilateral relationship has flourished into what we could call a quadrilateral security initiative with the addition of Japan and Australia into this relationship there. So when we look into the vistas of the Indo-Pacific, the vistas of the Indo-Pacific is not only with regard to the Quad, but the centrality of the Quad itself is based upon the bedrock of the US-India naval as well as maritime relationship that has gone a very long way there. Secondly, there has been economic transactionalism that has gone between the two countries in the bargaining trade that has gone between India and the United States. Much of that trade going through the Pacific, and India has played a very important role in terms of keeping the sea lanes open in the Indian Ocean region there. Ever since the war against terror had started from 2001, India had played what we could call an informal net security provider in terms of how this shipping has gone throughout the region there. India has also benefited, India and the United States have also benefited from technology transfers that has buttressed India's military capacity, and also in terms of the platforms that India has been able to acquire, particularly in the naval domain. Trade interdependence is one important aspect that is again basically maritime oriented, and we find that this has been a very important constituent by which the India-US relations have flourished into it. What we expect in the Indo-Pacific region is a rules-based order, which will provide not only a confluence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, but it will also be an order which will basically look in terms of peace and tranquility. And the most important thing is that the confluence of democracy is coming together. The Indo-Pacific region would remain to be free there. Having said this, I will not take much time, but I would like to invite Dr. Raji Rajagopalan and Mr. Gregory Pollak to make the remarks, and then we will set the discussion on through. Thank you. Dr. Raji Rajagopalan.
Thank you, Lawrence, and good morning, good evening, depending on the time zone where you're joining us from. First of all, let me thank the organizers, both the CPR and the US Consulate General in Chennai, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts on the Indo-Pacific. As Purvaja mentioned, the idea of the Indo-Pacific is not new. In fact, in one of the earlier articulations in recent times, came from the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe when he spoke of the confluence of the two seas in the Indian Parliament in 2007. Further, of course, in 2013, the first official recognition came in the Australian Defence White Paper, identifying the Indo-Pacific as a new theatre. In 2018, the US indicated its preference for the Indo-Pacific terminology in its national security strategy and renamed the US Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command. In 2019, ASEAN, France, and other countries came out with their documents indicating their visions of the Indo-Pacific. But over the last year, many other European countries too have articulated their Indo-Pacific strategies. But the Indo-Pacific strategy came out as a framework for a couple of different reasons. One, as a way to include India as a partner with a leadership role, because the Asia-Pacific did not really include India. The second reason is, of course, to bring out the strategic maritime spaces of the Pacific and Indian Ocean as one strategic entity. The Indo-Pacific region is a significant one and a vast maritime space with the interests of many maritime players converging, be it India, Japan, France, and the United States, as well as several medium and smaller powers like Australia and Indonesia. While a number of traditional maritime security issues challenge the Indo-Pacific waters, today's uncertainty comes primarily from China's expansionist agenda, as well as related questions such as the US commitment and willingness to play a leadership role in the region. The fact that the region does not have an overarching security institution binding the entire region in addressing that challenge poses additional questions. The current competition and rivalry are also a function of the Asian and global power transition and the changing balance of power dynamics. With the rise of China, the return of a more normal nation in Japan, and the reemergence of Russia, the Indo-Pacific region has become the theater of the great power competition. As for India, it has tried to bring the maritime attention through some of the recent policy initiatives. India, for one, has articulated its idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. It has also given maritime security a major focus through initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which is a reiteration of India's commitment towards a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region based on a rules-based order. Prime Minister Modi, while announcing this initiative, said the objectives of the IPOI are to ensure the safety, security, and stability of the maritime domain. The new initiative enlarges the focus on the strategic maritime space in the Indo-Pacific and is also a clear indicator of India's willingness to address China's maritime aggressiveness in an emphatic manner. The proposal has been welcomed by many in the ASEAN region, and other Indo-Pacific powers also have entertained this idea. Explaining the agenda of the new initiative, the MEA said this would involve creating partnerships among interested parties in several pillars ranging from enhancing maritime security to preserving and sustainably using marine resources, building capacity, disaster prevention and management, as well as working together in trade and maritime transport. However, and despite these pronouncements, India continues to lack a coherent Indo-Pacific strategy. India has taken, of course, certain administrative policy steps in furthering the importance of maritime security and the Indo-Pacific in the overall strategic architecture. For instance, in April 2019, India set up an Indo-Pacific division within the Ministry of External Affairs, meant to integrate under one Indo-Pacific umbrella the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, the ASEAN region, and the quadrilateral of the Quad countries. In September 2020, an Oceania division was created in the MEA in September 20, again to streamline some of the efforts concerning the maritime spaces. These are important because these are the maritime space. This is a maritime space where China has been particularly proactive to maintain a dominant standing, and India is also seeking to assert its own role. A second major issue to me is the absence of a clear focus, even when we talk about maritime security. So what are we talking about when we talk about the Indo-Pacific maritime issues? When we engage on a number of issues such as HADR, the humanitarian assistance disaster response, environmental issues, blue economy, humanitarian issues, and anti-piracy, and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to underscore the importance of these issues, but this is more for public consumption. And the real challenge for India and the Indo-Pacific region is China's military power. But there are differences in terms of how the major Indo-Pacific powers look at this China focus as well. For instance, to a large extent, the US, Japan, Australia, and even New Zealand, for instance, the focus continues to be China's efforts in South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. But for India, rightly so, the focus is on the Indian Ocean. So there are questions about how do you coordinate and kind of bring about a better convergence of the two sets of issues, even as it pertains to China. India has traditionally played a significant maritime leadership role, but since its independence, due to a variety of reasons, continental issues gained greater salience in its national security thinking, and therefore has abandoned the naval and maritime aspects in its overall thinking as well. But the rise of China and its aggressive military and political behavior in the Western Pacific and increasingly into the Indian Ocean has prompted many countries to look at India as a balancing factor. There is expectation among these countries that India plays a major role in ensuring a secure maritime environment and effectively deter China and restrain China in its expansive activities in the region. Therefore, the Indo-Pacific framework provides India with enormous opportunities to partner with like-minded countries and major stakeholders in the region. As of today, India's threat from China primarily comes from land borders. But this is going to change in the next 10 years for sure. China's growing Indian Ocean presence is not just about contesting India's strategic role in the IOR Indian Ocean region, but it's also a part of a determined agenda to emerge as a key player in the Indian Ocean region, which feeds into China's larger objective of becoming a global maritime power. The PLA Navy's growing strength means that it is shaping up to be a formidable force to reckon with. This is complemented by China's growing maritime ties with the number of countries in the IOR, and increasing naval presence in the region. India has multiple concerns about China in the Indian Ocean. One already alive is China's activities in India's Indian exclusive economic zone. Even though the Indian Navy has been able to deal with these problems as of now, the scenario will be significantly different within the next 10 years. It is not clear that India is thinking through these issues in a focused manner and acting on them. India has been long wary of power plays in the Indian Ocean, but today it finds itself with few options but to participate in securing a free and open Indo-Pacific. Clearly, there are other political problems also in India's articulation of this further. In terms of its strategy for maritime security, it's still very unclear. We have a sea control strategy, but we might need to move to sea denial. Again, are the political leadership and the defense leadership thinking along those lines and acting on them? Also, the inter-service rivalry and the maritime capacity developments are serious issues when it comes to India playing a proactive role in this regard. Since the Galvan conflict, India is once again likely to have a continental focus and ignore the maritime capability requirements. The step-sisterly approach towards the Indian Navy reflected in the small budget that continues to be an issue. The capacity issue, therefore, is a significant one. Even though the Indian Navy is still the fifth largest in the world, it has been found lacking on many fronts. A few numbers: the size of its shipbuilding capacity, industry, the port handling facilities, connectivity, and the size of its merchant fleet would reveal the shortcomings in materializing an effective maritime strategy for India. Falling submarine numbers is another important indicator in this regard. India has around 15 conventional submarines in operation, many of which require immediate replacement as they're already obsolete. The Navy being capital intensive, it also spends far more on its budget on capital expenditure as compared to the other two services. But the falling budget as a proportion of the Indian defense budget has not been helpful. Given these capacity constraints, which India recognizes, and the increasingly aggressive Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, the Modi government has altered its approaches to Indian Ocean as well. In early 2015, Modi, in a speech in Mauritius and Seychelles, talked about cooperation with external partner powers in the Indian Ocean. including countries like the United States, Australia, Japan, France, and others, and countries that have partnered with India in conducting security dialogues, military exercises, and exchanges. This changed approach is possibly an Indian acknowledgement of the fact that India faces serious capacity constraints in managing the Indian Ocean by itself there, especially considering the prospect of China becoming a major player there. In this regard, it's also important to note the logistical agreements that India has concluded with a number of countries, including the US, Japan, France, and Australia. And these to a large extent extends also India's maritime outreach and strengthens the overall maritime security cooperation. To sum it up, I think I would say New Delhi is likely to continue to engage in large regional meetings and summits, but it's also probably likely to step up engagement at bilateral and quadrilateral and trilateral levels, any number of minilaterals. In fact, a thicket of overlapping partnership with like-minded partners is a better bet than following just single-track partnership with any one set of countries and so on and so forth. In order to develop the concrete ideas on the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, India's efforts cannot be limited to a normative exercise alone. Strategic partnership with the other key countries, in fact, especially the financially more capable countries, such as Japan and others, might become critical in the coming years. I'll be stop there and I'll be happy to take on any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raji, for this succinct presentation. I now invite Mr. Gregory Pollak to make his remarks, please.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, and thank you to CPPR and the U.S. Consulate for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. I think that my remarks will be largely complementary to what we just heard from Dr. Raji. So I'd like to focus on three areas where I think growing India-U.S. collaboration on maritime security is key. One of those is direct security cooperation, enhancing deterrence at sea. One is on diplomatic and normative efforts. And the other, which connects to both, is on maritime domain awareness, capacity building, and particularly the support we are providing jointly. I look like the host muted me, to small island developing states and littoral states around the region. So on the first, this has been very well covered. I mean, everybody sees the press reports about growing U.S. India bilateral, trilateral, and quadrilateral cooperation, the growth of Malabar, increasing weapons sales, all of the various access and logistics agreements we've signed. And I think we should not, we should all appreciate how far the relationship has really come. I mean, over the last 25 years, it really has been remarkable progress given where we started. You know, things like the sale of P-8s early this year to India, which are still underway. The fact that we had the first ever U.S. military aircraft refuel at Port Blair just at the end of last year. I mean, these were, I think, really unthinkable steps and signs of strategic trust 10 years ago. And that is being facilitated also by the growth of India's network of security cooperation with other American partners, which is increasingly tying India into kind of a like-minded club when it comes to this. So you have the India-French naval cooperation growing in the Indian Ocean. We had the first joint exercise out of Réunion between the Indian Navy and the French Navy. We have India now having access to Changi Naval Base in Singapore, where the US and UK and Japan will also operate. India has signed logistics agreements and access agreements with Australia, with Japan, with ROK. I mean, really tying itself into the network of like-minded, rule-supporting states in the Indo-Pacific. And all of that amplifies the bilateral defense cooperation at sea that we're seeing between Washington and Delhi. That is all, I think, critical to deterrence, particularly vis-a-vis China, which Dr. Raji talked about. But I think everybody can agree that deterrence is not an end in itself. Ultimately, our shared goal has to be to incentivize Beijing toward better behavior, to convince the Chinese to change the way they behave in the Indian Ocean, in the South China Sea, you know, on the shared border, the land border with India, on all of these fronts in which China is increasingly under Xi Jinping proving itself to be a revisionist state, threatening the rules and norms that we've all come to accept. And there, the long-term solution is not military. It is diplomatic and economic cost imposition, convincing Beijing that its goals of being a global leader are better served by acting within the system than without. And so when we look at efforts like increasing Indian support for freedom of the seas and the increasingly close, the parallels that we see between language that you hear from, for instance, Secretary Blinken and Minister Jaishankar, what we're hearing is a growing chorus that extends well beyond Delhi and Washington, of like-minded states saying that we support a certain definition of the rules, particularly at sea, and that Beijing's behavior, be it in the South China Sea or anywhere else, is seen as a threat to the entire global community. And I think that's increasingly valuable. That's one of the places where I think growing collaboration through the Quad is going to be most valuable, because it presents a diplomatic platform in which US, Japanese, Australian, and Indian leaders can all show that they are of one mind on key issues, not on everything, but certainly on key issues. And we'll have to see what comes out, hopefully in the fall, with the in-person Leaders Summit and the results of the Maritime Security Working Group. It's one of the 3 working groups under the Quad. But I think we will see that rhetorical, that normative effort from Delhi and Washington increasingly converge. And one of the places I hope that we see that is over the next couple of years, a more explicit statement from Delhi in support of the 2016 arbitration award in the South China Sea, in which we've heard, I mean, really since the immediate aftermath of the award, we've had Indian cabinet officials very strongly hinting that China should abide by the award, saying things like, well, you know, when India was taken to court by Bangladesh, we followed through with our arbitration. This is how great powers should behave. Moving from that to a more explicit, China should follow on close and follow the results of the arbitration, where I think that would be quite valuable, because that amplifies the message coming from the other now 9 states who are calling for that explicit Chinese abiding by the ruling, mostly because when the US, Japan, Australia, Iraq, Canada, etc., when they all complain about Chinese bad behavior, it's very easy for Beijing to brush that off and say this is just a case of US containment, the US rallying its allies in support of whatever issue. When India joins that chorus, China can't make that same argument, because everybody knows that India is not an ally of the United States. And so if India amplifies the messages coming from the US alliance network, it makes them much more than the sum of their parts. It creates a much greater weight behind those complaints, and it provides cover for other non-aligned states to do the same, to step out and say, we actually also disagree with Chinese behavior. We've just been unwilling to say it when it looked like it was part of a US containment policy. Both of these, the direct security cooperation between the US and India on maritime security and the normative alignment on how we talk about the rules-based order between the seas, I think they are both facilitated by what's probably the most direct area of cooperation right now, which is the growth of maritime domain awareness and capacity building that both states are providing to the region. So directly, we're seeing more and more focus on information sharing, data sharing. India is making use of the Sea Vision platform developed by the US Department of Transportation and the Navy, taking part in more frequent US-led, Japanese-led, ASEAN-led maritime domain awareness, maritime security dialogues. We're developing a shared set of definitions, rules, norms, behaviors for how all of us are monitoring the maritime domain. And at the same time, we're seeing India engaging in the Indian Ocean region, supporting the maritime domain awareness capacities of smaller states in the same way that the US and Japan are in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. So India is now funding radar and other support for the Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, tying all of those radar networks back to the Navy's Indian Ocean Fusion Center in Delhi, and then providing that data back to the partner nations. The US is doing similar efforts in Southeast Asia through the Maritime Security Initiative. And what we are approaching is a point at which the US, India, and both of our partners throughout the region are getting closer and closer to a persistent maritime domain awareness capability, fueled mostly by low-cost remote sensing, satellite technology, and cheap radar that will allow us to, provide public goods, search and rescue, counter IU fishing, anti-piracy, but also to keep an eye on bad behavior from China and others, enabling smaller states, to document what happens in their own EEZs and come to realize just how much illegal and illicit behavior is occurring in those areas, and therefore amplify the message that we are putting out, that China is threatening fundamental rules of freedom of the seas. We have to do all three of these things at once, right? We do have to strengthen short-term deterrence. We do have to invest in long-term diplomatic cost imposition on Beijing. And in the interim, we have to make sure that our smaller partners are capable of monitoring their own waters in the same way that we can, and of talking about the bad behavior they see in the same way that we do. And all three of those converge, I think, in ways that are very important. The last thing I'd like to address very quickly is when we talk about the threats that we face at sea. As Dr. Raji said, there's often a bit of a disconnect. We agree on the principles. We disagree often on the focus. And I think in interactions I have with Indian counterparts, there is clearly, we all care about Chinese activity in the Indian Ocean. We all care about Chinese activity in the South China Sea. We care which one of those is the primary theater is where we disagree. And one of the things that I think we can recognize, we're not going to erase that disagreement, because India's national interests are what they are. But Chinese threats, Chinese claims in the South China Sea run counter to international law in a way that no other state's maritime claims do anywhere on Earth. And if China's claims in the South China Sea are accepted de facto by China's smaller neighbors, it will lead to an unraveling of key components of international maritime law that both the US and India and all of our partners spent more than 2 decades negotiating. It will undermine India's national security interests and threaten freedom of the seas globally. And so while I don't think we should expect India to play a direct role in the South China Sea in the way that the US, Australia, and Japan do, it is increasingly clear that India's own interests are at stake in making sure that other states don't succumb to Chinese pressure in the South China Sea, because you cannot ensure freedom of the seas in one place if you abandon it in others. And I will wrap up there.
Thank you, Mr. Pollak, for your remarks. That has been comprehensive as well as analytical there. So now we will have the discussion open up. And I believe Mr. Pollak had to go earlier. So those who would like to address the questions to Mr. Pollak, please do make it. And then we will take the other questions for Dr. Raji.
Dr. Lawrence, I believe we have some time to do a moderated discussion among the three of you, and we can pose the questions to Dr. Pollak around 6 o'clock.
You still have time. Okay, that's fine. So thank you both for your remarks that you made on the reimagining of the situation there. So I would like to basically put forth a couple of questions to both of you, so that this interaction can go on more than me speaking at this point. First and foremost, to both of you, what do you think will be the revisited strategic vision of India and the United States in the years to come, the next 2 years or next 5 years to come there? Given the fact that the PLA Navy's expansion program is all full swing, and what do you think will be the US and India positions on this? Having said that, I would also like to have another point here. The United States rebalancing to the Indo-Pacific has been in progress there. And do you think that this will provide the conclusive balance of China, both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the Western Pacific? And what would also be India's complementary postures to come in the coming years? That's my question. I think either of you could answer that.
I can take the first shot, and they are, well, these are very broad, I think, contested discussions. So I don't want to claim that I have all the answers here. I think increasingly, U.S. and Indian strategic interests and threat perceptions are aligning in ways that they never were before. And that is going to drive, I think, greater collaboration on arms sales, development, joint exercises, eventually I would imagine joint maritime patrols, in ways that were really impossible due to the lack of strategic trust even 10 years ago. China is a great leveler here. I mean, not just India, you're seeing it in the US-Vietnam relationship, you're seeing it all over the region, right? When we all share the same anxieties about another rising power, suddenly our own disagreements seem much smaller by comparison. I expect that we will see greater US-Indian collaboration on joint training and joint exercises with third parties outside the Indian Ocean in the years to come. Vietnam is a clear example where you are seeing, India is the foremost non-Russian security partner of Vietnam, precisely because India is the only other major party that can provide training, parts, and equipment co-produced with the Russians, which is what the Vietnamese have. And so there's clear ways to amplify efforts there that it wouldn't make sense for the US to engage in. I think that a big part of this, as I indicated in my remarks, will be increased maritime domain awareness. I think both India and the US have an interest in getting us to a place in the next 10 years where we are capable of monitoring all Chinese activity anywhere on the oceans all the time. And that is being driven by the revolution in access to low Earth orbit, both NASA and commercial entities here, as well as Indian commercial and government players are moving us toward a point at which every vessel on Earth made of metal over 5 meters is trackable. And it will be up to us to be able to make sure that we know how to use that and can provide that to our partners so that Chinese bad behavior can't hide under a basket. One area that I think I'll just flag that I think we should both be talking about more that we haven't so far is what Chinese access to third parties in Southeast Asia, and particularly Cambodia, mean for Indian maritime security. There's been a lot of folks in the US about China's impending naval access to Ream Naval Base in Cambodia and its air access to Dar es Salaam Air Base in Cambodia. But when you draw out the range rings, what you quickly discover is that Ream and Dar es Salaam don't get China any closer to US facilities or to Singapore or to the Straits of Malacca than China's bases already do in the South China Sea. The only thing that Ream and Dar es Salaam get China is the ability to harass the Thais and Vietnamese a little bit more, but it also gives China the ability to monitor through over-the-horizon radar Indian activity around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and in the Andaman Sea. And so we should have a much more clear discussion with India about what we think China is likely to use its growing access to the Gulf of Thailand for. And I think it'll be pointed at India as much, if not more, than it'll be pointed toward US and its allies.
Dr. Raji?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Lawrence. And of course, I agree a lot with what Greg has already said. Just a couple of things I wanted to add to that. One is, of course, the India and US, I think seriously, and India, US, and not just restricted to the two, but other Indo-Pacific powers also need to think about what they can do together to strengthen the capacity building exercise for smaller Indo-Pacific powers, because in terms of whether it is in terms of training or in terms of providing equipments and platforms, what they require, we are not talking about high tech, but at the same time, providing what these countries require for enhancing their maritime security capacities. I think that is something we need to think about. This has not been particularly part of our conversations in terms of providing support to third countries and strengthening their overall capacity building exercises. So I think that's something that is need to happen in a sense. The other point, I think Greg touched upon it, but again, I've been thinking about it for quite some time, is the monitoring of the Indo-Pacific maritime spaces, how that coordination can happen among the Quad countries or even with the involvement of other major maritime powers. Because every country, and I think that requires whether among the key Indo-Pacific powers or the Quad countries need to have a lot more consultations and coordination kind of mechanisms built in there so that every single country doesn't have to be involved in every major theater in a sense. So Japanese keep track of a particular section of the maritime spaces, and once the Chinese vessels leave, then somebody else's responsibility, somebody else take charge and monitors the Chinese, where their ships, where are they going, and so on and so forth. So that kind of a coordination so that you have a real-time picture of the Chinese naval movements in the Indo-Pacific Indo-Pacific maritime spaces. And I think this is something that we need to be doing. And okay, the Quad or even the major Indo-Pacific powers have not reached that level of coordination and sophistication in that sense yet. But I think the more number of political dialogues and security consultations happen, I would think this is something that is a natural next step for the Quad countries and other major Indo-Pacific powers to have to do it, to engage in. And I think that's going to be very, very useful, especially as we and over the next few years, this will become much more intense. And I think this is something that we need to keep up with in terms of watching out for what the maritime space is.
Aside from the strategic security perspectives, what do India and the United States envisage in terms of public goods at sea in the Indo-Pacific? Because I think public goods at sea is a very vital aspect in the age of what we could call as global commons. And in the age of transnational events, challenges and disasters, what will be the public goods that India and the United States will bring into the Indo-Pacific? I would like to have both of your opinions.
Greg, do you want to take on first?
I'll jump in first. Yeah, I mean, I think both Dr. Reddy and I have alluded to this. A big component of this is increasing the ability of our partners and kind of the global ability to monitor the oceans. Whether we do it because we're worried about China, or whether we do it because we're worried about piracy or maritime crime or IU fishing, ultimately it all comes together in the same way. Right? The first goal toward monitoring any threat, traditional or non-traditional at sea, is maritime domain awareness. And the biggest hurdle in places like the Southern Indian Ocean, the Pacific Islands, is the lack of maritime domain awareness capabilities by small island states. We are in a position to help address that. And if we can get to a point at which all of the ocean is effectively monitored 24 hours a day, then we get to a point at which IUU fishing and piracy and trafficking are no longer productive commercial activities. The fact that it also helps us monitor Chinese bad behavior will be a great bonus, but you can do both at once. And the former is a public good that's less provocative, less sensitive for our various partners and allies to get on board with.
Ajay?
Yeah, let me just add to that. Of course, I think Greg has clearly made the point. In terms of strengthening the capability of our partners and the ability to come together, interoperability, and those are the kind of things that will add to the sort of strengthening the public goods in the maritime spaces. For that, I think a number of India, for instance, traditionally shied away from engaging in smaller exclusive groups and so on and so forth. But I think India is also now getting a lot more comfortable, especially over the last few years. The China threat has become a lot more intense, a lot more precarious. The kind of scenarios that India possibly plays out, whether it is in the Indian Ocean or elsewhere, it is becoming a lot more serious. And therefore, India's own willingness to partner with like-minded countries and I think the US is the most key player out there. But I think India is also now, India, along with other US allies as well, they recognize the need to also forge closer security partnerships within Asia, for instance, the larger Indo-Pacific region. Whether it is India-US-Japan triangle, or you have the India-US-Japan-Australia, the Quad, but also the Asian triangles, for instance, Australia, Japan, India are an important sort of a conversation that happens there. So I think there are many more these kind of minilaterals and such kind of formulations that will come about in order to strengthen the overall sort of a maritime partnerships to secure the maritime security order, the freedom of the seas, the ability to move freely, the open seas and freedom of navigation. I think those are the important aspects that will continue. The other traditional issues, the piracy and kind of thing that have figured prominently for quite some time, but I think it is becoming more, I think the kind of issues like the HADR and such kind of issues are becoming more prominent. Piracy has got to the back burner in some sense within the Indo-Pacific stream. It is more in terms of the HADR is an important live issue for the. But I think overall, I think the interoperability that is gained through a lot more such engagements will go a long way in strengthening our ability to respond to any situation in the maritime domain. And I think that's the overall gain that I see from such engagements.
What convergences do you see in the US G7 initiative of Build Back Better World to be in the Indo-Pacific? What would be the aspects in which India and United States would converge in such an initiative to bolster what we could call as infrastructure connectivity in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, this is an area that the infrastructure and connectivity, and both in terms of the physical infrastructure and connectivity as well as the digital connectivity. These are areas that should be prominent in the Indo-Pacific context. The dialogues among the major Indo-Pacific powers. These have not been really, because whatever has been done so far in terms of the allocation for infrastructure development has not been sufficient to counter or anywhere match up to the kind of the investment that China has made through the Belt and Road Initiative and so on and so forth. And these are areas that we need to invest in, because many countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, are looking to do a pushback on China, but without an alternative, another alternative option available, it becomes very difficult for them to do a pushback and sort of resist the Chinese kind of a pressure to work with them on certain connectivity projects. So both in terms of digital as well as physical infrastructure connectivity projects have to become part of and not just a talking point in terms of rhetoric, but how much money are you willing to, and what kind of mechanism can you develop? For instance, can you create a public-private partnership, something like there have been a couple of models in the US-India context where a clean energy project have been looked at and so on and so forth. So can there be some sort of a public-private partnership where both sides put in enough money, both from the Indian side and the US side, so that there can be a win-win because the governments may not have all the money they need. So bring in the private sector, which are also capable players in a sense, to strengthen the overall capacity in the region of the smaller countries, because I think the connectivity is an important one, even including digital connectivity, especially over the last year and a half. Countries in the region have gone through several, have had to first of all jump into the whole digital revolution that is taking place in the backdrop of the pandemic, and how well are they sort of capable, or how well are they able to sort of adjust to the new realities? And so what kind of technologies can you transfer? Can you give these countries? Can you give access to? And what kind of systems have worked? Digital payments and kind of things. So India, for instance, has been trying to partner with some of the countries in the Indo-Pacific region, Southeast Asia in particular, to sort of to at least tell them as to what are the kind of different models and examples, whether it is in terms of the digital health sector, to deal with the effect of the pandemic and kind of thing. So I think connectivity has to be both infrastructure, physical border infrastructure connectivity, but also the digital connectivity offers enormous opportunities, but not something that has seen enormous funds that come with it. Without the economic power, these things will remain sort of much of a talk and in terms of rhetoric. So I think that's where we need to improve upon our capability.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Clearly, our shared comparative advantage is on things like digital connectivity, smart cities initiatives, perhaps some aspects of green energy transformations, although on a lot of that, including solar, China clearly has speed. We should invest in all of that. Our biggest problem remains our lack of, both the US and India's lack of real alternatives on physical infrastructure. Neither of us do this very well. India's Act East policy has not resulted in any major infrastructure projects. There's been, the Sitwe port in Myanmar and the highway from the northeast are still not built. The US does no better. And Japan has been saving both of us on this front, right? The only alternative to Chinese infrastructure in most of South and Southeast Asia is Japanese. And we can't expect Japanese state funding to keep up with China forever. So we need to help Tokyo on this front. We don't have the state capacity on either, nor do we have the kind of the tradition in either Delhi or Washington of doing this the way the Japanese do. So we do need to incentivize private companies to provide alternatives. And the other place where we can clearly come together in efforts like the Quad, and I hope that'll be a focus of the infrastructure working group, is on standard setting, right? Provide agreed upon good, best practices that recipient countries in South and Southeast Asia can take and say, okay, even if it's a Chinese project, here are the international standards that we expect it to meet. And that'll help us. I mean, we should be honest. Countries are going to take Chinese capital. It would be insane for them not to. And not all Chinese investment is bad. Chinese investment that comes with no competition is bad. But when Chinese companies are forced to compete on an even playing field with other competitors and under global standards, then Chinese capital can be a net benefit for recipient countries.
Thank you for both of your remarks. Now I'll open up the discussion for the participants to ask questions. And I request those who have questions for Mr. Gregory Pollak to ask first, because he had to leave earlier, and then we will follow it with Dr. Raji later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, and thank you to both the speakers for their inputs and comments and scholarly thoughts on the subject. So as Dr. Lawrence mentioned, we will ask Mr. Pollak the questions first, since he has to leave early. The first question comes from Mr. K.V. Thomas, who's a senior scholar affiliated with CPPR. He asks, in the changing geopolitical scenario, when economy plays a key role, how effectively does the US play the leadership role in building up critical deterrence against Chinese designs to ensure hegemony in the Indo-Pacific region? Mr. Pollak, would you like to answer?
I thank you for the question. I mean, I honestly think that the answer is that the US can't do any of this by itself. And that's been difficult for the United States to accept, as we saw clearly under the last administration here. But the US, we live in a multipolar world in which China is now a peer competitor and has significant, and I would argue unbridgeable, advantages on certain fronts, including in the ability to provide state capital to strategically and politically important economic projects throughout the region. China is far more able to leverage its economic heft for political benefit than the US or any of its allies. The only way that like-minded states can hope to leverage China into better behavior, deter Chinese aggression, and build up the resiliency of smaller neighbors is together in grand coalitions. And they don't have to be formalized through some kind of Asian NATO, but they do have to be a tight network of, I think, trilateral, quadrilateral, multilateral, issue-specific initiatives on infrastructure, on investment, on maritime security, on cybersecurity, and on and on and on. The goal should be to wrap the region so tightly in coalitions of the willing on like-minded issues that China finds that it is better off working within those systems than without it.
Thanks, Mr. Pollak. I'm moving to the next question from Asha Sundaramurthy. She asks you, according to you, do you see a stronger engagement of the US in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific under the Biden administration, or do you see a continuation of a hands-off approach of former President Trump? Will we see the US engage in TPP?
Those are two different questions. TPP is the easy one. No, the US is not going to rejoin TPP under the Biden administration. And the Biden administration, I think that's a terrible decision, for the record. And I think every strategic thinker in Washington thinks that's a terrible decision, but I will give them credit. They've at least been honest about it. Every single time they've asked, they've said there's no way that the US is rejoining TPP. There's no way that the US is going to negotiate any comprehensive trade agreement under the Biden administration. The best we might get is something on specific sectors, probably digital trade. And even that is going to be very, very difficult. So the Achilles heel for this administration is clearly going to be their lack of trade policy, which is going to be a fundamental factor in this administration, and probably for the next administration too, given politics in the US. Whether the Biden administration is going to engage in Asia more overall, I think the answer is yes. I mean, it's not as if the Trump administration didn't engage in Asia. It's frankly that I think the Trump administration engaged in Asia in the wrong way. I mean, we saw significant progress on the bilateral U.S.-India relationship under the Trump administration. The problem with the Trump administration was that they felt that they could engage in Asia only bilaterally or through a network of bilateral engagements, and they refused to pay the kind of attention to regional architecture that you need. They refused to engage in positive sum diplomacy, so everything really outside the U.S.-India relationship, everything was a zero-sum competition, even with our own allies. What the Biden administration is likely to do is continue the same level of interest and effort in Asia that we've seen building ever since the Obama administration, but do it, I think, more strategically, recognizing, as Secretary Austin said in his Singapore speech last month, that the U.S. no longer has the capacity to do this alone, that no country can do it alone, and that the only way the U.S. can compete with China is by having a close-knit network of allies and partners that amplify U.S. capabilities. See, perhaps the way to think about this at this point is that the U.S. may be indispensable to any counter-China coalition, but it must be done in a coalition, right? The U.S. is insufficient to the task on almost every front.
Thank you, Mr. Pollak. The next question is, do you think that India's territorial security is related to developments in the Indo-Pacific? If yes, how?
Yes, I think that when we see, so I'll just speak about the China-India angle of this. I think when we see Chinese revisionism, bad behavior, China rewriting historical status quos, whether it is in the Himalayas or in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait, it is indicative of the same mentality that has been amplified under the Xi administration since 2013, and that must be pushed back on. Right? None of us can afford to try to deal just with our piece of this, right? You cannot try to hold China to rules-based order and good behavior in the South China Sea and ignore what they do on the Black. You cannot try to push back on their gray zone coercion against Taiwan and ignore what they do in the South China Sea. You must either draw a line that says this behavior is unacceptable across the board, or you will accept that China will slowly eat away at our coalitions one by one until it gets what it wants.
So the next question is, Mr. Pollak, we're getting a lot of questions on the Quad. So one question to you on that would be, do you see South Korea joining the Quad? The Democratic administration's language to describe the ROK includes this phrase, the linchpin of stability and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. So at the moment, the administration isn't exactly saying that it will happen due to differences between Japan and ROK. So are these significant enough to keep South Korea out of the Quad for the long term?
I don't think we're likely to see any formal expansion of the Quad. I mean, for one thing, we haven't even institutionalized the Quad itself, and Delhi's quite clear that it's not comfortable with the idea of institutionalizing the Quad. So, I think the Quad, the Quad right now is kind of in the quantum realm. You can't actually look at it too hard or try to measure it, or it disappears. So the Quad only works if it's informal and we all choose not to talk about what exactly it means. What we are likely to see is that specific Quad-based initiatives, probably right now focused on the three areas established by the working groups, maritime security, infrastructure investment, and global health, that we'll see coalitions of like-minded states jumping onto those efforts. And so if in the fall we announce a Quad effort on investment, infrastructure investment or green energy centers or whatever, then you can imagine that like-minded states, including Korea, would want to be part of that. On maritime security, I would imagine the Vietnamese would want to be part of that. The Koreans might not. And so the Quad, I think, becomes the core of a network of very loosely institutionalized lines of effort on different issues. And everybody will find something they like about it and can avoid the stuff that they find to be too sensitive.
So, Mr. Pollak, maybe one more question for you. This is from DS Murugan Yadav, and he asks, so what is your take on the role of islands in the Indo-Pacific region to enhance the US-India cooperation, particularly when it comes to countering the Chinese presence in the region?
I wish that my friend Arshana Barua was here to answer this question, since she's the expert here in Washington now on islands in the Indian Ocean. I mean, I guess channeling her as best I can, I would say that island, geography is what it is. I mean, whether it's in the 21st century or the 20th or the 19th century, presence matters, and securing access points on far-flung island territories, both in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, is key to monitoring and being able to deter Chinese bad behavior, particularly in a world in which islands often have outsized legal and diplomatic influence given the rules established by UNCLOS. And so, networking the Indian access in the Andaman and Nicobar with US access in Diego Garcia and French access in Reunion allows us a network to monitor and respond to activities in the Indian Ocean that we would be utterly incapable of doing from the coasts.
Dr. Pollak, thank you so much for your thoughts and your questions. I'd like to bounce it back to Dr. Lawrence for some last comments or thoughts from Mr. Pollak before we let him go.
Thank you, Mr. Gregory Pollak, for those succinct remarks. Again, quite comprehensive. And I think you enlightened on a variety of issues, not only on the security strategic aspects, but also in terms of connectivity, in terms of infrastructure. And it was great having you on this panel, and best wishes in all your endeavors. God bless.
Thank you all. And I'm so sorry I have to run, but this has been a fantastic panel.
Let's move to the questions for Dr. Raji now. So Mr. KV Thomas asks, so here's a question on the changing profile of maritime security in the light of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the fluid political situation there. So how would India use the maritime route from Kandla to Chabahar port if the new political disposition blocks the land route? Keeping apart China, what will be the likely standoff the US, Russia, and Iran would have in this context from the maritime angle?
Thank you. I think, yeah, that's a terrific question. And in fact, I think this has been in the minds of a lot of, this has been part of a lot of conversation. There's a lot of chatter about post-Afghanistan exit of the United States, what happens really, and especially the pace at which Kabul has fell at the hands of the Taliban. I don't think the pace had been really, we did not really anticipate it had to happen this quickly, maybe a couple of months from now. But the way things have unraveled in Kabul has really opened up. But I think there have also been some questions overall on the where does the US stand in terms of, I think there has been some sort of a, so where does the US stand in terms of its credibility? Are there questions of that? And does that really implicate the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific? To me, I think it would have, I don't think it would have a lot of negative impact on the Indo-Pacific, overall Indo-Pacific strategic dynamics, the strategy itself, or the framework that we are working together on the major spaces, for a couple of different reasons. One, I'm not suggesting that whatever happening in Afghanistan is not important. It is very distressing what's going on. But at the same time, we should not be losing sight of the important issues that have brought the US and India, as well as the other major Indo-Pacific powers on the same page, which is China, and ensuring a rules-based order and so on and so forth, freedom of navigation, free and open Indo-Pacific. And so those issues should not be sort of, in a sense, confused, and we should not lose sight of them. But in terms of given the reality in Afghanistan, how does it affect the Chabahar port? It's just been something that has been going on for a very, very long time. We have seen some progress. Then I think we take 2 steps forward, 4 steps backward, and kind of thing. We have, gone through several ups and downs with the whole Chabahar port and how we might be able to transport stuff from the Central Asian region and so on and so forth. I think there have been questions about it, but of course, if the land route is going to be possibly blocked, and I think there are going to be problems. But in terms of keeping apart China, what the stand of US, Russia, Iran in the context of maritime angle, I think I have a slightly different take in a sense. For instance, I think Russia in recent times have been far closer to China to, it makes India a little uncomfortable about it, especially from a national, I'm not talking from an emotional perspective, but Russia used to be traditionally a close friend of India, close partner of India, but at the same time, especially since the developments in Ukraine in 2013-14, the kind of strategic equations between Russia and China have changed significantly. So today, Russia needs China a lot more than anybody else. So they don't really care about the India partnership, how important that is, and so on and so forth. So I'm just looking at it from a very national security and pragmatic perspective. And to me, in that sense, it is the US and it is US as well as other Indo-Pacific powers, France. These are the important powers that we need to be concerned about, and with whom we are actually building the maritime security collaborations in a sense, strengthening the maritime as well as other sort of larger, broader cooperation agenda in a sense. So those are important for us.
So Dr. Raji, the next question to you is from Arun Kumar, and he asks that despite moving towards strengthening the Indian maritime security, is India focusing less on space security, which also actually helps in reinforcing maritime security?
Yes and no. That's a good question, because I say yes and no because I think even as we talk about as to how the Indian Navy should get a better share of the defense budget, should see a larger focus in terms of, because Navy is a capital intensive and it takes time to build your capabilities. So if you invest today, you're not going to see the returns tomorrow or even next year, and kind of thing. It takes about a decade before you see the capabilities out in the operation. So it's something that we need to invest in. But having said that, even the Indian Navy has been feeling the crunch in terms of the funds being allocated to them. That's one set of issues. Second, on the space security, I would not say that we are ignoring space security and kind of focusing less on it. But at the same time, more than anything else, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact on the Indian launch capabilities. The number of launches that have happened over the last couple of years, when you look at it, it's been pretty low. We had moved up from somewhere between 9 satellites launches, 9 launches in a year on an average, to somewhere around 15 a few years ago. But now we seem to have gone very badly in terms of the number of launches we have been able to. And I think last year we just had 2 launches. This year again we had just 2 launches, and the last one was not as successful. There were some technical glitches. So in terms of the manufacturing of the satellites as well as the launch capability, we have stepped back. But in terms of the space security per se, I would say that the growing demands, there is a capacity deficit within the ISRO. The ISRO has not been able to meet all of India's growing space demands, whether it is the communication requirements, whether it is the tele-education, telemedicine kind of requirements, or you're talking about the Indian military requirements, the naval communication. We have a 1 satellite, dedicated satellite, but the satellites for other armed forces like the Army and the Air Force are still pending. So there have been growing demands, and the ISRO has not been able to keep up with the growing demands. And I think that's where we need to talk about. And the government has made some announcements last year about involving the private sector in India's space story, space growth trajectory, in a sense. If we want to stay competitive and address the growing requirements of space capabilities and so on and so forth, we have to bring in the private sector as an independent stakeholder who is also able to deliver in terms of both manufacturing as well as launch capabilities. But the government made a few announcements last year. Finance Minister Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman made their announcements, but it has to be followed up by appropriate regulatory and policy framework. Only then can it become a reality. So in a sense, there have been announcements, but these unless we see some regulatory framework changes and kind of thing, our space competitiveness could be affected in the near term as well.
Dr. Raji, I think I'm going to ask you the same question that I posed to Mr. Pollak about, the islands. So a slightly differently worded question. So do you think there is a need for India to rethink a new island strategy in the Indo-Pacific in order to commit its position as the net security provider of the region? How can the role of islands, help India in the move in the area to counter the Chinese presence?
Yeah, absolutely. I am not an islands. Like I said, there is, Greg said, Darshana Baruba, she has been focusing specifically on the Indian Ocean islands in a sense, and how islands fit into the overall framework or strategies of India, US, and other major maritime powers in a sense. But I think the importance of the islands cannot be ignored, because I think they have also been now increasingly getting caught in the major power competition between the US, China, and maybe even India, Australia, and so on and so forth. So at the same time, providing them with effective alternatives, capacities, capacity development for these island countries is also something that is very important. The capacity development in particular for these countries are in terms of the environmental disasters, climate change related disasters and kind of thing. So how adaptive they are and how capable they are in terms of addressing some of these challenges become critical. And so giving them assistance in the areas where they need them the most, I think that's something that we need to pay attention to. What is it that island countries require, and give them that, rather than just come up with our own package and trying to impose on them in a sense. So that's not particularly helpful. But at the same time, I think reaching out to them, getting their sense of what are the kind of different requirements that they have. And I think we have been stepping up our certainly over the last 5-6 years, we have stepped up our approach to island nations in the Indo-Pacific waters and in the maritime spaces. But I think that needs to go forward in terms of continued collaboration and capacity building.
So, Dr. Raji, coming to a slightly different question. So how far is PPP or private investment advisable in strategic areas when you look at the security side of it? How far can it be foolproof in the digital world today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the use of private sector is a new reality that we need to come to terms with, whether it is in the defense sector, whether it is in the space sector, and even nuclear. We have not really opened up the nuclear sector to the private parties asset, and the private sector is also extremely wary of investing in India's domestic nuclear sector, nuclear energy sector, civil nuclear energy sector, for instance, primarily because of the liability act that we have in place. But having said that, in terms of the private sector participation in areas like the defense or space, we are becoming much more open to that. We have increased their proportionally, when you look at it, we have strengthened the possible role of the private sector in each of these sectors. And you can come up with appropriate, like I said, appropriate regulatory framework is the key here. And so instead of denying or giving a blanket, having a blanket denial and saying we will not engage with the private sector, which is not a very useful thing. Look at other countries, how they have dealt with the private sector, and how the private sector has been an important stakeholder in developing their national capabilities, including in the strategic domain in a sense. So I think we need to come up with appropriate policy and regulatory framework so that they can contribute to India's strategic sectors as well. But at the same time, without us losing any, having any loss in these key sectors.
So Dr. Raji, Sanchita Chawla asks a very interesting question and a long one there. So she's asking you that speaking from a comprehensive perspective and also depending on your engagement with the subject, is it maritime security, be it in the IOR, in the Indo-Pacific or the South China Sea, isn't it a multi-layered issue? Alternatively speaking, doesn't the maritime environment depend upon a lot of other environmental issues, other issues, but especially outer space in terms of radar, surveillance satellites, and other systems? So therefore, to look at it in a proactive way, do states not need to take a holistic approach given the aggressive Chinese developments in space as well? So, how can other arenas of conflict, competition, and collaboration be brought into the picture to facilitate policy goals in the Indo Pacific and the IOR?
Yeah, terrific question. And I would, if I have to say it in one line, I would say we need investment, significant investment, hike in the budget allocation to all of these different sectors, whether it is space, whether it is cyber, or other types of electronic warfare, maritime, everything. All of this needs significant, but at the same time, we have a relatively a small kitty in a sense available. And how much money can we then, so what are the priorities that India has to focus on? Which are the priority areas that India has to focus on, and how much, it also depends. For instance, when it comes to the Navy, you might want to make some significant investment today because the return is not, it's the development of the particular technology will not happen overnight. So you might want to make the investment today so that we have the technology ready at least in another 10 years time. But at the same time, so there is a huge technology lag when it comes to whether in terms of space, space, maritime, and all of that. And look at the kind of maritime spaces, for instance, the Chinese ability to do serial production of submarines. The submarines may not be the top line. They may be still very noisy diesel submarines and so on and so forth. But the fact is that they have the indigenous capability to develop on a serial, engage in a serial production of the submarines. Our numbers are like somewhere around 15. They have close to 70 submarines in a sense. On any number of issues, or the pace at which China is developing the aircraft carrier program. And how they have come about with that, again, is fairly astonishing, the manner in which they have come about and the pace at which they are developing. So it's fairly sort of significant in a sense. Space, again, they have also embraced, China has also embraced the private sector as a major actor in stepping up the overall space competitiveness of China. So China has been able to make sure that they get all the different stakeholders, not just the state to play state organization to play a role, state institutions, but also bring in the private sector as a key player so that their competitiveness is one step ahead. And they're of course looking ahead in terms of competing with the US. Their level of competition is with the US. So obviously their level of sophistication is also that much higher and so on and so forth. So we significantly need significant allocation, important allocation to be made in different sectors. But at the same time, in the post-COVID pandemic era, I think this is going to be extremely difficult given the economic impact of the COVID pandemic and how the economies have already shrunk so much. And it will take a couple of years at the very least before we recover. Because this also means that our the allocations for the space or defense, all of this is going to be further reduced in the budget. So our capacities are going to be, the material capacity is very, very significant if we have to be able to affect any changes on any domain. And I think we are going to be limited because of the economic impact of the pandemic for sure.
So Dr. Raji, I think I'll probably pose the last question to you for today. The same thing that I asked Mr. Pollak about, there is an increased curiosity about the role of Quad and whether Quad would be institutionalized, whether it would be expanded to include countries like South Korea. How can India play a significant role as part of the Quad? So would you like to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's an important question, especially if you talk about the Indo-Pacific strategic engagements and kind of things. Quad is one of the most concrete agenda that has come. See, the fact is that you had a Quad, the first avatar of the Quad happened in 2007. it withered away for a number of different reasons. But the fact that a decade later, the Quad took a second avatar and came back clearly shows that the threats and challenges that brought the first Quad is still alive. Not only still alive, it has intensified or magnified in many terms, that there is a willingness on the part of even countries like India to go embrace the Quad as an important initiative to take forward in terms of ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific. And whether there is a possibility of a Quad plus, including countries like like South Korea. So there is a Quad plus initiative that is being going on mostly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, talking about vaccine diplomacy and post-pandemic recovery, economic recovery, and so on and so forth. But in my view, I think there's a likelihood that this particular grouping, including countries like South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand, which is part of the COVID-19, Quad Plus initiative, they could become part of and this grouping could become part of a sort of a larger strategic, grouping with a strategic intent in a sense, in a post-COVID scenario. So I think the Quad expansion is a possibility. I'm not saying that it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think there are, and the Quad itself it's just a name. It just means 4 countries, but you could have any number of minilaterals that could take shape and that could kind of bring together a number of different countries, like-minded partners, to work together to ensure a rules-based order, to ensure that to ensure a free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific order that emerges. And again, when we look at the overall goals of these engagements, this is not about containment of China, because containment of China is, I think that's a ship that has sailed a long time ago. We are talking about how do you manage China? How do you ensure a China that plays by the rules of the road, who respects international law, who uses dialogue and negotiation instead of military and muscle power as the first resort to resolve border and territorial issues or sovereignty related issues. So how do you get to manage China is the key question. And for that, I think any number of coalitions and minilaterals kind of groupings will come about in the coming years, because I don't see a China that is becoming a more accommodative or a benign power in the near future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raji, for answering so many of the questions that our participants posed to us. So before I, formally close the proceedings for the day, I'd like to go to Dr. Lawrence. Sir, maybe, this last question that I asked about the Quad, would you like to also take a stab at that? And then maybe, give your final comments before I close? Dr. Lawrence?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry it got delayed actually. Thank you, Raji, for the extensive remarks that have been concise as well as comprehensive. It covered a vast swath of issues in the Indo-Pacific that not only range from the Indo-US dyad, but also in terms of the various permutation combinations of strategic change. And the vistas to come has been widely covered by both of you. I have nothing more to say, because much of what I wanted to ask and transact has already been done there. With that, let me thank the panelists, Dr. Raji Rajagopalan and Mr. Pollak, for this excellent comments that they made on the panel, and for all others who had asked questions. And thank you and God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, and a big thank you to you as well for moderating this webinar so beautifully. Thank you, Dr. Rajagopalan, for your comments and your insights today. And thank you to Mr. Pollak as well, who left us for his next engagement a few minutes ago. I'd also like to thank our co-hosts and partners, the United States Consulate General Chennai team, for their support, Consul General Raven, Ms. Anne Lee Sheshadri, the Public Affairs Officer, Biju Kumar, Chitra, Sujata, Susi Nirmala, and Dipti. Also in absentia, Maulik Barkana, who was involved in the initial stages of this project. A thank you to our organizing team at CPPR, team lead Angela, Joseph, Sri Arvind, and Rajesh, who were responsible for pulling today's event together, to Paul for the coordination and guidance, and to our chairman, Dr. D. Dhanuraj, for conceptualizing and guiding this project. You can find all the information related to this discussion series and CPPR's research areas on our website, www.cppr.in, and our social media accounts. With this, I'd like to formally close today's proceedings. We at the Center for Public Policy Research hope to see you again in October for the next discussion of the series on trade relations between the US and India. Good evening and goodbye.